Nettie, all the liberal studies students, when they take on the liberal studies major, are taking on extra work than most other majors. Not that other majors are easy, but this requires them to really work with several disciplines, different professors, and so on, and put together this project. So thank you, Nettie, for taking that on. And I also want to thank the two professors, because the professors, this is what, when they work with liberal studies students, this is not part of their regular load. So they take this on as additional work out of commitment to the students, and I'm
we
very, very appreciative. I'm sorry?
We bug them a lot.
Yes, exactly, and so do I. So, I thank both Professors Dukwasada and Dr. Okada for their work with Nettie, and so Nettie, now the podium is all yours.
Okay, thanks. I wish the clicker worked so that I could come up a little closer, but it doesn't. So my presentation is about idioms, a cultural lens through which we see the world. My contention is that the last most difficult stage of second language acquisition is the leap from being grammatically proficient to a native-like proficiency and the cultural mastery of the language, especially the cultural aspect. To substantiate this claim, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the process of second language acquisition by saying the stages of language acquisition, the perennial question, how long does it take to learn another language, walk you through a few of the methods used for teaching languages, the definition of proficiency, or more commonly called fluency, but proficiency is a little better word in this area, the levels of proficiency, and the idea of does the language I speak shape how I think, and then use idiomatic phrase sets to as examples, because I'm using similar phrases in English, French, and Spanish to show that they are very culturally based, and that such phrases can very easily confound second language learners, while they actually also add a lot of texture and beauty to the language. They add a lot of spice and verve. So the cultural aspect usually is, or oftentimes is, a lifelong learning stage, but these are the first learning stages that each person learning another language goes through. The pre-production, also called the silent period, because they don't know enough vocabulary or grammar to feel confident to say anything. The early production stage, then moving to the speech emergence, intermediate fluency, and advanced fluency. Every learner takes a little bit of different time to move through the stages, dependent on how much effort they put into it, and dependent on what method they're using, all of these different things. But a general idea of how long it takes from first being introduced to the language to move through the steps. It takes about 3 months to move through the pre-production period, 3 to 6 months from first contact with the language to move through early production, 6 months to 2 years to move through speech emergence, 2 to 3 years for intermediate fluency, and 4 to 10 years for advanced fluency. These stages are determined by, moving from stage to stage is determined by the amount of vocabulary the learner knows, their ability of comprehension and production, and their comfort in using the language in different situations. In all of these steps, culture isn't even mentioned. These are some of the teaching approaches that have classically been used in the classroom. The grammar translation method relies heavily on vocabulary lists and grammar rules, and they use memorization in which to really make it part of the students. The audiolingual method leans on ingrained habits, trying to instill these by repeating drills in language labs, and the communicative approach. Various communicative approaches are generally communication-based, and they are tailored more to what the student needs, such as Spanish for the medical profession or French for the business world, these sorts of programs, or maybe even phrases for tourists. The downsides of if these methods are used alone are that sometimes students find the grammar translation method to be a bit sterile, and that it's difficult to transfer all of this really theoretically based knowledge into real-world application. The audiolingual method, since it makes repeated habits, can omit the spontaneity of conversation, and some students find it boring to sit alone in a computer lab talking to themselves in the computer. But the communicative method can be less holistic. If you're focusing on just one thing, maybe phrases for tourists, you're probably not going to learn how to read and write classical literature. The communicative method has spawned a lot of commercial do-it-at-home methods that people hope to take as the magic pill to learn these languages quicker than if they were learning it in a classroom setting. The Pimsleur approach, or the Pimsleur program and the Rosetta Stone program, are two popular programs used for language acquisition. And the 10,000 hours rule is a different approach, not so much a commercial approach, but a different approach on how long it takes to learn a language. The Pimsleur program is an audio-based program. It breaks up its teaching into 30-minute lessons with 4 levels of difficulty, which build on each other, coming out to 120 lessons. This program promises in 60 hours of lessons to deliver spoken proficiency. But this program lacks in reading, writing, and cultural aspects. The Rosetta Stone program is more interactive. It does a lot with picture matching, reading and writing, and speaking and listening exercises, with each level supposedly taking, according to rosettastone.com, 40 to 50 hours to complete, which should take about 250 hours of concentrated work to attain near all-around proficiency. But this can lack culture, and it means that the learner must have access to a computer and can only work on this program on a computer. The 10,000 hour rule to become an expert was designed by Anders Ericsson and his team as more of an all-around rule for any skill that a person would want to acquire. But Sarah Eaton has applied it to proficiency in language. This came up with some really interesting numbers. I found that she said it's not so much what method you use as how much intention you put into it and how much time. So she said that if a student takes 4 hours of class per week times 2 semesters, it will come out with 96 hours of intense training per year, which would mean that the student would take 104 years to become proficient in that language. Not my method of choice. Eaton also says that there's no best way, but that immersion, just through the simple amount of amassing more hours more quickly, would get the student to proficiency faster. Meaning that if you take 8 hours of sleep per day and you're immersed in a culture, that you would have 16 hours per day of intense training, and that with 365 days per year, you would get 5,840 hours per year, which would mean about 2 years to proficiency. So, what's proficiency? Suzanne Romain, who is a linguistic anthropologist, among many other things. She's very good in her field, studies bilingualism, so I turned to her to find out what proficiency means, since it means proficiency in two languages, generally the native language and the language being learned. I found that what she found is that scientists working in the field describe bilingualism as anything from producing a meaningful utterance to native-like control, which means the entire range, anything. So there's no exact consensus, but do we actually look at proficiency and measure it? Yes. ACTFL, it sets standards for levels of proficiency in learner evaluation and also sets guidelines for instructors. They measure in 4 main areas: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And culture is the 5th area, although it's not directly measured. It's measured in its usage through all of the 4 other areas. And they break down levels of proficiency into 5 levels. The new 2012 proficiency guidelines added on distinguished above novice, intermediate, advanced, and superior. Superior used to be the highest level, but distinguished is now the highest level. Each level is characterized by what the learner is capable of producing in a particular skill. For example, the big differences that I noticed in reading their guidelines on their website between superior and distinguished are a more specific overall ability and the grasp of culture. In the reading category, it states that distinguished level students can understand writing with a number of historical, regional, and colloquial variations of language, that they can appreciate the richness of written language, and comprehend language from within the cultural framework, while superior level readers are only listed as generally aware of aesthetic properties of language and may not fully understand texts in which cultural references and assumptions are deeply embedded. The firm grasp of culture is really the difference between superior and distinguished levels. And even though the distinguished level is the highest, the ACTFL guidelines says that distinguished learners do not necessarily perform at the level of native fluency, and in the speaking category they say that distinguished level learners may have a limited control of deeply embedded cultural references. ACTFL does not mention how long it takes to get between the levels. It doesn't tout a method. It just measures proficiency. Since living cultures and languages are always evolving, achieving fluency and understanding a culture and its language can be a lifelong process. There's a Czech proverb that says, you live a new life for every new language you speak. If you know only one language, you live only once. So, does the language I speak influence the way I think? Does it shape my thoughts? Betty Berner, who wrote an article on this, said that language, thought, and culture form 3 strands of a brain, with each one affecting the others. These form a person or culture's paradigm. So with this coevolution of the language and the cultures and the thought pattern, you really can't teach, learn, or understand a language without all of the parts. They're inextricable. You can't just teach the grammar and say that you understand the language. It's what really makes the learners see through the eyes of another culture. Colloquial language adds the real individuality and the spice to a language. It's what lets people play and understand jokes and idiomatic expressions that they wouldn't otherwise understand at all, would completely trip up second language learners. But it's not often taught in classrooms because of various reasons. With slang, for example, it can change, the meaning of slang can change very quickly, or whether a word is still used can be time sensitive. Not very many people still use groovy. It can also be culture and region specific. The same word used in Mexico may mean something completely different than the one used in Spain, even though supposedly they both speak Spanish. Also, phrases, especially idiomatic phrases, are handed down within a family, a culture, or a group, so that they're not used in a sterile environment. They're only used in familiar language, in the living language. So it's hard to teach them in a classroom when it's not in actual practice. And it's hard to learn them without being in the place where they're actually being practiced. Idiomatic phrases are often not based on logic, and they don't have an immediately apparent sense, for example, and they also often contain non sequiturs. For example, "it's raining" is understood by second language learners, and "cats and dogs" is understood, but "it's raining cats and dogs," when you put the phrase together, if you aren't already familiar with it, then it can be really difficult to understand. But native speakers can think that these idiomatic expressions make a lot of sense because they were raised on them and they don't see how funny these phrases are. The idiomatic expressions demonstrate that understanding and language acquisition depends on the understanding of the culture, and that understanding of idiomatic expressions is time sensitive. They're not necessarily something that you'll walk into first level language and start learning all of these cultural expressions. You may, but you probably won't understand them at first. And acquisition ability to use idiomatic expressions is a function of method. If they're taught throughout consistently with a way of learning, then it makes a lot more sense to the student. It gets more integrated into their lifestyle with this learning, with this language, than if the culture is taught as a just, oh, by the way, at the end of the chapter, here's some culture. So I'm going to use idiomatic phrasal sets, 3 of them, with phrases in French, Spanish, and English, to demonstrate how different cultures address the same situation. The first expression is about weather. "It's raining cats and dogs." And these are all my own drawings. This is not generally my medium of choice, so bear with me. They're supposed to be very silly to show how silly these phrases can be. The direct translation of "it's raining cats and dogs" can be "cats and dogs are falling from the sky." A little confusing. It means it's raining heavily. Now, the origin of this phrase, there are 2 potential origins that I know of. Norse mythology had a lot of influence on early English. So in Norse mythology, dogs were equated with heavy wind. And sailors used to equate cats with witches who brought rain. So it's raining cats and dogs, heavy rain with wind. Or else it could be a misinterpretation of the Old English word catadoop, which means waterfall. It's raining waterfalls. It's raining cats and dogs. Il pleut des cordes is the French equivalent, meaning it's raining ropes. All 3 of these mean that it's raining heavily. I found 3 potential origins of this one. one that criminals used to be hung on days when it was raining so that it would wash away their sins as they died. Another is that it's depressing when it rains, so people are more likely to hang themselves. Or just the visual aspect. When it's really raining, sometimes it looks like it's coming down in sheets or strings or ropes, so it's raining ropes. Está lloviendo a cántaros is a Spanish interpretation of it. It's raining buckets. And this one is cited as just being pure hyperbole. It's raining so hard as if someone were pouring water from a bucket directly down upon you. Do you like my funky buckets? Okay, the next set has to do with body parts and value. In English, we say, it costs an arm and a leg. Someone might interpret this to mean that something actually costs body parts. It just means that the item is very expensive. And this one actually was easier to track down the origin because the first known usage was in 1949 in an American newspaper, actually. This is an American phrase having to do with World War II amputees coming back and saying, the price of your freedom are my limbs. I thought gas was rather apt for this one. And I didn't want to draw really creepy pictures. I tried, it was bad. Ça vaut la peau de fesse. It costs the skin from the backside is the very polite way of saying it. The item is expensive. One origin that I found for this is that when horse riding was the only form of transportation, if you couldn't sit down on a horse, you couldn't travel on one. So if you had no skin, you could not travel. You were stuck. There are, in French, different uses, different forms of this phrase that include different body parts, the most vulgar of which I did not include. And it goes, this phrase with different body parts goes from very vulgar to fairly polite. So some use, it costs the eyes from the face, it costs that's the skin coming off, the skin from your backside, or it costs an arm. In Spanish, they have eso cuesta un ojo de la cara. It costs an eye from the face, and means it's expensive. One origin of this that I found was that in the wars with the Incas, the conquistador general lost an eye to an arrow wound, and when he came back to his king and queen, said, "We won, but at great cost. I lost my eye in the venture." But since there's a phrase that's pretty much exactly the same in both French and Italian, I would guess that this comes from Latin roots and came in as the languages were actually being established. So I have a guy buying a diamond ring with his own eye. The last set has to do with intelligence. In English, sometimes we say smart as a whip, which some people might think that we hold whips as signs of intelligence. This is, everybody thinks it's a bookworm. It's a whip with glasses reading a book. So, the intent of the phrase is to say that the person described is intelligent, clever, and quick-witted. This one I actually had a lot of fun finding the roots for. It comes from the Germanic word smert, which means to hurt. And in the 17th century, it also took on the meaning of intelligence, so something along the lines of sharp wit, cutting remarks, these sorts of things. But the whip part came in because you use a whip to smarten or get the attention of a horse. So you smarten the horse, it's smart as a whip. In French, they say malin comme un singe, smart as a monkey, or clever like a monkey. And that's a monkey on a tightrope reading a book, so very agile and intelligent at the same time. This phrase came through some transition. Malignus was the Latin word that meant to intend to do harm, intend to do bad things. So Christians originally used this phrase as a very negative phrase, and the monkey was seen as the devil's animal in early Christian carvings. But now it's come around to the point where the phrase is more of a compliment, saying that you're intelligent, clever, and quick-witted. In Spanish, one of the many phrases used is más astuto que una zorra. It means more cunning than a fox. The origin that I find most likely for this is that foxes are seen as cunning and sneaky, and that you often don't know that they got into your hen house until it's too late. And so this grew out of agricultural knowledge. So I have the fox defeated, leaving the hens all nice and safe in their house with a padlock, and the farmer is very happy because he outsmarted the fox by locking it up. So idiomatic expressions, I used all of these to show the cultural aspect because they show both the similarities and differences between languages. In the same situation, these different languages use the same form to deal with them. They all come up with idiomatic expressions with these really fun cultural phrases. The difference comes out in the content, that the content is really culturally based, and so it's different for each language and even very different between regions. Also, they provide a creative cultural commentary. The more creative, the more liked and the more they stick. They use a sense of quasi-humor by juxtaposing these non sequiturs, things that don't go well together or that you would never think of going well together. So that little leap when your brain says, wait a second, it causes a little bit of humor and breaks people out of their normal everyday rut of thought. Also, it provides camaraderie between different people who know the same phrases, who maybe come from the same place or the same cultural roots. And so oftentimes these phrases are used as just fragments, which allows all the people who know the phrase to really understand it in just one word, or to really appreciate that that person also knows the same phrase and said a whole paragraph of a comment with one word or part of a phrase. This is what really lets people know when they know the language and when they can understand the jokes and play is when the language comes alive, which is a big point of why people learn languages, so that they can actually relate to other people and cultures. And this, when they understand some of these, is when they really get to have fun in the language. Clearly, learning a new language takes a lot of time, patience, and sustained effort. But when we see through the eyes of another culture, that's when we know that all the effort has been worth it. Learning culture can be a lifelong endeavor, but it's all of this sort of fun stuff that makes it worthwhile. Without culture, language can be a really sterile collection of grammatical parts of speech and conjugations, which isn't nearly as much fun as playing with all of these different expressions and understanding the jokes. So these sorts of things are what really add the beauty and the texture and the fun into languages. So even though it seems like it's the last and lifelong most difficult part of learning a language, I contend that it's very much worth it. there is another Czech proverb that says, learn a new language, get a new soul. By seeing through someone else's eyes, you get to experience a whole new world. La culture et la langue ensemble, elle vaut la peine. Together, culture and language are worth it. Does anyone have any questions? I'll go to something a little more interesting. I'm excited. Anyone? I know that was a lot to cover in such a short amount of time. But
Actually, I do have a question.
yes, please.
Because I knew you wanted to be put on the spot.
Okay.
The original concept or idea when we first met about your project had to do with advertising and cultural differences. So I'm wondering if by working on this project, which was actually a branch of the original project, you can actually appreciate, thinking back at all the advertisement you saw in Europe. Because I don't know if your audience at all, well, tell them your experience before.
Last year I went and studied abroad. I spent 5.5, 6 months in Switzerland, in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. Journeyed around a little bit, but mostly stayed in Switzerland. And then I spent 3 months in southern Spain, in Granada, which is very Islamically influenced. It's where the Alhambra is. It was the last stronghold of the Moors in Spain. So I did see a good bit of advertisement, and I felt like there was so much of it that I just missed because I didn't get the jokes. I didn't know all of these phrases that they could use one word of, and everybody would just connect, would just get it. But me, being an outsider, being someone who didn't know everything about that culture, I missed so much of it. I just have no idea how much I missed. So yes, I think it does reflect, and I think that, yeah, I was really leaning more towards the phrases than advertisement, but I see how they interplay.
In advertisement, it's not only about language, but also about images.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm sure that you saw images and you were wondering, how does this relate? What are they trying to sell? And again, it's all related, but anyway, great job. I really like that we it all came together, and especially since I do see the relation of the original thought and how it develops from advertisement to more apposition answer.
I'm going to also try to put Nettie on the spot.
Oh, perfect.
You talked about a larger idiomatic expressions. Have you reflected, number one, on the prevalence of smaller idiomatic expressions? I'm going to just give you an example, like the verb to take. If you say, take a book, that's the action of taking. But if I say take a plane, that's not taking a plane.
Yeah.
If I say take a nap, that's not grabbing a nap. If you say take a hike, I don't even know what it means. But you get
Lots
my
of
point.
things.
Is that, so, have you reflected on the prevalence of this kind of idiomatic expression that are non sequitur and they defy logic?
Yeah.
And what human beings need that?
I haven't gone quite as in depth with that as I have with this aspect, but that has struck me for a long time, basically all my life, just whenever I think about that sort of thing. Yes, I find them fascinating, and I wonder about some of the origins of why that would evolve into having so many meanings, and so many meanings that don't necessarily have too much to do with each other. Yes, they fascinate me.
And human beings just love variety? Is that what we give them?
To a certain extent, it's what really makes, I think that it's what really makes a language come alive. So nature abhors a vacuum. We don't like to to have really sterile straight lines where you follow this and you say this and this and this. We don't like it. We like to go the winding way around. We like to turn widdershins and just use crazy words and have all this descriptive ability with language.
See, maybe I still say groovy.
You still say what?
Groovy.
I do too.
Time sensitive.
But I was going to tell you, Nettie, that actually brings about connects it to perhaps why it's so difficult to leave the silent period, because second language learners are used to being able to produce, and then it's very frustrating for them to go back to accepting that they need to take those baby steps. They don't want to go, put A and B together. They want to be able to do A, B, and then add some more.
Yeah.
And
modify
that
it by
accounts,
C.
yeah, and that accounts for, that's right, accounts for a lot of frustration and a lot of silence.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Anybody else? Will?
Yeah, at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned a couple of ways that people use to learn languages, like Rosetta Stone. And, what would you say, in your opinion, is the most effective of the tools?
Well, I forgot to mention that with the classroom methods, they're usually not used individually. They're usually integrated so that you use a little bit of the audiolingual and you use some of the grammar translation and you use a lot of the communicative, so that it's a more well-rounded, and the cons don't come out as much. I would say that what is the best depends on the student. It depends on their learning style, what they want to learn, and what sort of method they respond best to. So there's not really one best way. There's as many best ways as there are students. I know it's not answering your question, but it's the best I can do.
However, perhaps you can actually answer it by whether or not you feel that immersion is maybe the answer. Like, you have the experience.
I think that it is a good answer. Some people may just freak out when they are exposed to immersion and say, I can't handle this, and it really doesn't work for them. But for me, I would like to be re-immersed in these languages so that, especially when I'm not surrounded by other English-speaking people, so that it's a lot easier to pick it up. I think that having that much exposure does make it easier to learn a language, because things come more naturally that you don't even notice that you were noticing. Yes?
How much do you think you could learn if you were really immersed in the language from what you had no basis of learning?
If you couldn't survive without it, I think you would learn pretty quickly. A lot of gesturing would happen at first, and it would continue for a while, but I think you would pick a lot up.
How would it change your time of learning in the sequence you had sketched out earlier about how many hours it took to learn? That's different.
I haven't studied any sort of such dramatic immersion from such almost alien immersion, so I don't know, but I would say that people would pick it up pretty quickly, but it would also depend on the surroundings. That if a person were dropped in the middle of a very busy city where people ignore each other, that it would be fairly difficult to pick up a language when everybody was just like, go away, you don't know what you're talking about. While if you were dropped in somewhere potentially a bit more rural and welcoming, then you would probably pick it up a little faster. I'm not sure. If you were dropped in a more welcoming society, it may be faster. If you were dropped in more of a leave me alone sort of society, you might become a hermit, or you might just start trying. I don't know. It depends on the person.
How do you think that advancing technology and globalization affects the uses of idioms or slang?
I
in
think
languages?
it homogenizes a lot of them. It's just like a lot of languages are being lost by lack of use. A lot of the little regional variation is also being lost by lack of use. But it also gives the chance for other idiomatic expressions to come to the forefront. Did I actually answer your question? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you did. In my own experience, I found that that a lot of, you pick up things that are essential, because otherwise you just don't make it. And, you'll urinate in your pants, for instance, if you don't learn all the most essential things. But after that, the most confusing things as you start to learn the language were people's names, because you couldn't look them up in the dictionary.
People or place names.
Yeah, and then it was just people or otherwise towns, names of towns, things like that that didn't relate to the subjects and verbs that were necessary to communicate. Were like, they were real clinkers. You just couldn't figure it out. Try and figure out, what is this word? It seemed like it was essential to the conversation, but you just couldn't find it.
Yeah. Clinkers. Perfect example.
Nettie, just to connect the frustration of technology in dealing with idiomatic expressions to share with you and the audience.
I would
There's
definitely bow to you for that
No,
one.
no, it's just there's a story where a Russian team went to MIT to see, this miraculous software that they created for translating languages. And so the MIT hostess said, give the machine any example. And they gave the machine the idiomatic expression of the spirit is winning, but the flesh is weak. And the machine translated as the meat is tender and the devil wants to eat it.
I've run across that one before. That's great.
When you were going over some of these expressions, when you said smart as a whip, it also made me think of sharp as a tack. And I was wondering if there were any other expressions that you thought about using for those three subjects, weather and body parts, and the other one.
Yes, I actually came across quite a few because Spanish is used over large areas of the world, as is French, and so is English.
Mhm.
So all of these different places came up with their own variations. So for the Spanish version of It's Raining Heavily, I came up with everything from It's Raining Buckets, which was most common, to Está lloviendo hasta los maridos. It's raining up to the husbands. It's raining all sorts of variation, just lots of different phrases. Yes, and so I did come up with a lot of different things. And including all of the different vulgarity in the French body parts.
And obviously, we don't have to go abroad to actually find these things. We find them in the U.S. They vary from region to region. I was actually telling my students today that I had never heard, I'm from South Florida, I had never heard now you're cooking with gas. That's my neighbor told me the other day. And I had I had learned recently now that I understood him, but I would have actually wondered what's going on here. You haven't heard it?
You haven't heard it.
Now you're not cooking with gas yet. Okay.
There's also another one that's sort of like that. Now you're cooking, which is, I think it might be a fragment of now you're cooking with gas.
Could you explain for those of mine?
It means now you're really doing well. Now you have moved up to the fast lane. These sorts of things.
Oh, I'm embarrassed that no one's ever said that to me.
Well,
They just speak formal English.
Sterilely. You speak too formally, I suppose. I don't know, but it doesn't come up in sterile situations. It only comes up colloquially. So you may not have been in the right situation for that.
I was fixing a light bulb outside the house, and the neighbor said, "Now we're cooking with gas."
That's the other part of that idiom, is that cooking with gas is much faster than cooking with electric. But it takes gas, heats up immediately. If you put a pot with water on gas, it heats up more smoothly than water and fire or electricity.
Right.
I personally want to thank Nettie for reminding us that we need to teach culture and moral culture. The first sentence I heard coming to this country was, "What's up?" And I said, "What up?" What's up?